Okay. Hello, Mr. Nathan. Um,
Hi, Carlos.
how old were you during the busing crisis? And where were you with school or your career?
Okay, well, let's see. The court order was in 1974 to integrate the schools in the fall of that year. So I was 36,
Hmm.
and I was I had gone through the Boston Public Schools, but I was long out of them.
Uh-huh.
I was um, uh, I had dropped out, gone on to college and had dropped out, and I was still working, um, working in a hospital setting at the time of the Boston busing crisis.
Where did you live at that
Ah,
time? Where in
I see,
Boston?
70. Well, I was moving around at about that time. Um, at various times during that year, I lived in in Jamaica Plain and also in Northampton, Mass.
Mhm.
Um, so some of the events I only knew of through the newspapers, and
Right.
some of them I heard about on the radio and TV.
Can you describe what happened?
Um, okay, I want to focus on my perceptions, which were
Yeah.
a little bit different than somebody that was might have been living in Boston and going to school at the time, or had kids in school. So um, I was a bit removed from it. I thought that the Boston public schools had been pretty good during the years I went in the 50s and the 60s. Um, uh, I knew about I knew that because of segregated neighborhoods, that a lot of schools were poor and had poor teaching, had poor facilities in certain neighborhoods of Boston that tended to be neighborhoods of color. Um, when they but I was removed from it because I was had finished school and gone on to other things and was working. When the court order happened in '74, um, there was a lot of community opposition, particularly in white working class neighborhoods of Boston, because they were the ones that were going to be the most affected, because they were the ones that were losing um, a cherished institution, neighborhood schools that were near where they lived.
Right.
Um, when school days came in 1974, there was vociferous, very united um, demonstrations in certain areas of Dorchester and South Boston against kids of color being bused into their neighborhoods and attending their schools. Um, Pretty soon I mean, it didn't take very long for this to erupt into random acts of violence, and um, these buses needed to have police escorts
Right.
or around the clock, um, and in neighborhoods of color, people were protesting because they felt they didn't get the they weren't getting the proper public protection. Their kids. Kids were being bused to a school like South Boston, and the windows were being broken.
Right.
Um, um, they they had to scurry when they got out of school at the end of the day and to their buses and be escorted out of certain neighborhoods under police escort. And within weeks, there started to be some I mean, some tit for tat kind of violence. Whenever there would be a new violent incident in the papers regarding attacks against people of color, you might hear about a white person being attacked. I mean, just to even up the score.
Right.
And my involvement really was secondhand, but it falls into that category. My sister-in-law, had been previously married. She had been married to a fellow by the name of Dick Polite, who was an auto mechanic. He was just a ordinary Joe,
Right.
but he wasn't that particularly good at being keeping up a good marriage.
Oh.
By the time of his death, he'd gone through 2 different marriages. He and my sister-in-law had divorced, and my brother Don subsequently married Alice, who used to be Dick's wife, and then Dick went on to another marriage, and he ended up that one ended up in divorce too. But during the busing crisis, the connection is that about the time that there was the flag incident on Government Center, where a number of youths from South Boston were protesting busing. This had been a regular occurrence since the school year had started. They saw a well-dressed young black man come out of City Hall and start to walk across the plaza, and they attacked him. This fellow was a manager in one of Mayor Kevin White's departments, and this was captured on nationwide television. It was in all the newspapers. Anti-busing youths attacking a black man on City Hall Plaza with a flag, on a flagpole. Let me see. I can't recall the fellow's name. He's currently the president of the Boston Architectural College, the black man, and I must say that he was very understanding of what was going on, because he wasn't badly injured, and he forgave his attackers, and went on to do his best to help racial reconciliation in Boston. But that one incident, the flag incident on City Hall Plaza, started a series of retributive attacks against whites in random areas of black Boston neighborhoods. And one of them involved Dick Polite. Dick was on his way home from work one day. He was on Harrison Avenue near Dudley Station, just driving along when a group of black youths apparently just rushed out from the sidewalk, stoned his windshield. They broke the windshield. Dick stopped the car, and the youths dragged him out of his car and pummeled him until he was unconscious. And I don't think anyone was ever caught and prosecuted for it. So Dick was, his next of kin really was his 2 ex-wives. He spent the next 3 years in a nursing home, in a coma, and without any apparent likelihood that he was going to be, he'd ever regain consciousness again. And he made history locally at that time too, because one of the other, another controversy, at the time was this whole thing about, people in long-term comas, whether we should ever pull the plug on them.
Right.
And in his case, Dick wasn't listed as a homicide for 3 years. And it wasn't until my sister-in-law Alice and Donna, who was Dick's ex-wife now, got together, and they collectively, the two of them, decided that it was time. Apparently he was starting to, his physical condition was getting worse, and they decided that it was time to remove any life support. So that in this case, they stopped the feedings, and it didn't take very long. So Dick was one of the casualties of the busing riots, but that wasn't until 3 years after the events in question. I guess my attitude was that it was a real tragedy that should never have had to happen. That is, Dick was a victim of other people's inactions or demagogic behavior. We had, when I was in high school, back in the 60s, we had, by the way, tell me when I'm going over.
That's fine. This is great.
When I was in high school in the 60s, I graduated in 66, there was a long wind-up to the Boston busing crisis. It actually had begun back in the early 60s, around 63, 64, when there were so-called freedom schools in Boston that were educating Boston's black community about the substandard nature of their schools and their teaching, and that they didn't have to put up with it, that they could ask for more, they could ask for equal opportunity education, facilities, teaching. So they had freedom schools, and the freedom schools were kids with the consent of their parents. They took the day off from school and they went to these educational sessions about what was going on in the public schools and how they were getting the short end of the stick. And within a couple of years, the NAACP in Boston and others started the push for remedies for the substandard schools in Boston's areas of color. And at the same time, the state had already passed I forget what they called it. It was, in effect, it was a desegregation act, but it only applied to certain areas of the state where schools were both substandard and had over a certain percentage people of color. Mm-hmm. And the city of Boston School Committee kept vacillating and digging in their heels that they didn't have a racial problem, that it wasn't, if they did have a racial problem, it wasn't intentional. And if it was unintentional, it wasn't something that they could solve. It was strictly one where people created it by living together in a certain neighborhood, and it wasn't the place of the school committee that tried to solve all of society's problems. So that was the arguments that were heard. And eventually the state threw a class action suit of certain parents and children in the Boston school system, won a verdict in the courts that the school system was de facto segregated and needed to desegregate. And it had to be a solution within the Boston school system as opposed to doing something like metropolitan-wide busing. And when that quarter came down in 1974, that's when the real crisis began. But that was all the backlog, and it never had to have happened. Subsequently, I became I went through college and then graduate school, and my concentration was in local American history, and in the course of my later job as a staff member at the Boston City Archives, we many years later sponsored a symposium on this, and I can remember Dick Hennigan, who at one time had been a chair of the Boston School Committee, saying at that symposium that we had back in sometime after 2000, that I think it was on the 30th anniversary, maybe, of the court order, that the school committee had had so many chances, and he had come around to the idea that the best thing that could have been done was the school committee to come up with its own plan, and which would have meant less disruption, more neighborhood schools, but desegregation. But it never happened because there was an intransigent majority on the school committee that refused to even consider coming up with their own plan. So it ended up that the State Department of Education came up with the desegregation plan, and it emphasized desegregation citywide and through busing, and this was the fruit of that approach. So it's a very sad turn of events, and we're still paying it for it many years later. You had 8 questions, though.
Yeah, well, you actually answered a lot of them in the segment.
Yes.
I have.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you were aware of the civil rights events that were happening throughout the country, probably a little bit before, especially in the South. But were you surprised that something like this, with like the violence, like racial violence, would happen in Boston? Or were you like not that surprised?
I wasn't surprised. People knew that the first wave of desegregation was where they had de jure segregation in the southern states, but one by one, many cities in the West and the Midwest and the Northeast started to be the subject of demonstrations and court actions about de jure desegregation. So it wasn't surprising at all. The only thing that was surprising is that Boston was one of the few cities that actually fought it right to the end. And I think it was because of the vehemence of the Boston political establishment, that the vehemence of the counter-reaction that occurred later on. They went hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. How do you think that mob mentality played a part in the events that took place during the Boston busing crisis?
Maybe that's true of human nature in all times. The kids that attacked Dick Polite, if any one individual in that group might not have dared to do it, but with 3 or 4 of their peers, and one inciting the others and saying we have to do something, and not wanting to be left out.
Right.
I don't think it's. That was a shame that it got to the point where people were inflamed to that point.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that something like this could happen now in Boston? Or do you think we've moved on far enough?
Could it happen again in Boston? I don't think we're any different than 40 years ago. It might not be the same issue. I don't think it can be predicted what the issue would be, but it would have to be something just as important as that issue was for people. That is, it was the future of their kids,
Mm-hmm.
that they got a decent education, or a feeling that they had no institutions in their neighborhood that they could control. That could happen again. That could very well happen again.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions. Thank you.